One of the most important pieces to a retirement income plan is figuring out how you're going to spend your money. And today we're going to talk about retirement withdrawal strategies. You have different options, but which one is best for you? And that's exactly what we're talking about today. I'm joined by my co-host, Jake. Jake, what's up, brother?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm great. We're talking about retirement withdrawal strategies.
I don't know what could be better.
Nothing's more fun than that. We have to figure out what is right for you. At least we can help you answer that question. So we first need to understand, though, what are these? How do they work? What are the basic principles and rule of thumb? And we'll also share what we do for our clients and what our preference is. There's going to be probably a slight variation depending on how much of this, especially if you're a DIY retiree, how much of this you actually want to do, how involved you want to be. And again, that's a reality that not a lot of people take into consideration. But if you're not willing to have a part-time job to some degree in managing this throughout retirement, there's probably going to be some of these strategies that are better than others and worse than others. So that's what we're going to walk through today. Again, a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about are maybe some things that you have heard before, but there's going to be some additional realities that we want to bring to the table because a lot of these people just don't think about it until it's too late. So depending on where you're at in that stage, maybe you've already retired, maybe you're about to retire, maybe you're thinking about retirement. Wherever you are in that, we're going to give you some clarity here. So Jake, let's start off high level, easiest one, probably one that a lot of people have heard of, the 4% rule. What the heck is that? How does that work?
It seems pretty easy. In practice, it's a little bit odd in retirement, and we'll talk a little bit about why. But this was developed by Bill Bengen. He basically baked in all of these assumptions. He took historical market returns looking back 30 years and inflated it and said, if you take out 4% of your portfolio using the December 31st value from the year before, you'll never run out of money. Now, there's been some time since that first came out. He's made some adjustments to that, but people are still stuck on this 4% rule as a rule of thumb. And I say stuck, doesn't mean it's the worst thing in the world, but just hear me out. This is kind of how it goes.
We're here to hear you out, Jake. That's why I have microphones.
We're here to hear you out. The
That's
microphone helps with that, actually.
That's true.
If you choose to use the 4% rule, imagine with me a retirement where the market goes down 20% and all of a sudden you're spending 20% less that next year.
That sucks.
I feel like we know from our clients that we work with and the DIYers that come to us, that's usually not an acceptable outcome in their retirement. And we generally speaking will talk with people about where's your basic expenses, where's your desired spending, and where's the kind of lowest acceptable outcome for your income to sit. Usually your basic expenses is like just scraping by. Your desired spending is like shooting the moon, although some people are more conservative than that. And then we've got to find that lowest acceptable amount. And the 4% rule puts not running out of money.
Right.
But it could put into jeopardy what we're able to spend on a year-to-year basis if the market goes down. Or if it goes up, all of a sudden, are you going to spend, instead of $100,000, are you going to spend $120 just because the market went up? Right? Kind of yo-yos you back and forth on the income spectrum. That's why it's not really the way that we would ever want to set up a retirement, relying on simply that.
And it's a good point. You brought up a couple good points there. I mean, things we'll get into, like creating the paycheck as well, right? I think that's one that a lot of people overlook. But ultimately, the other thing there too that you said is expenses, lowest acceptable spending. And that's what we talk about a lot with people because, like any financial plan, whatever inputs you're putting in there, that's as good as your plan's going to be or as bad as it's going to be, right? As accurate as those actually are. Whether it's your one-time expenses that you cook in, whether it's your ongoing expenditures. But that's the thing you really need to get clear on before you implement any of these strategies as your expenses. Now, some of those are variable. Some of those are maybe up in the air. One-time expenses, like we said, we bake in. But you're right. Some of these are going to be a lot more aligned with your expenses, and expenses are going to play a larger role, like, for example, the 4% rule. Or it's going to maybe not have as much of an impact. And again, you just have to find what works for you. Jake, let's shift into the bucket strategy. I think this is one that I probably have seen more people implement than others. I'm a fan of the bucket strategy, but buckets are referred to a lot of times, especially in a lot of videos. A lot of people refer to buckets. They mean different things. So really, what is that? What does that look like? And how do people set that up?
Let's talk about the real believers first. The people who are like, setting up a retirement income bucket is the absolute truth. Big T, capital T.
All right.
Those people are setting up their retirement in a way where it doesn't really matter how much goes into each of the buckets. I'll kind of explain them. It's short term, medium term, long term. And mostly there's going to be cash or like CDs, short-term CDs or notes in the short-term bucket. There's going to be bonds, longer-term notes, longer-term CDs, maybe municipal bonds. Those are going to be in your medium-term bucket. And then on the long end, you're going to have your stocks. And so people who are using the bucket strategy in such a way that they're actually going to just work through the buckets throughout retirement, they are draining that short-term bucket. Then they're draining the medium-term bucket, and then they're living on stocks at the end. And that's kind of the true believer, I'm doing bucket strategy type of way. And that feeds into sort of the reverse glide path allocation method. And I'm going to kind of set that to the side. We can talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
But if you're living off those buckets, let's say you retire at 57 and you have 4 years of cash saved up. And then you have another 7 of bonds built up for that medium-term bucket. And then you've got your long-term stocks on the other end. It's a way for you to say, I've got a systematized way to draw these buckets down until I get to full retirement age for Social Security. Then I know that kicks in and I've got stocks on the other end to help me keep up with inflation or to do more than I thought I could at the beginning, depending on how the performance is. So that's the true believers in the bucket strategy. The second way you can look at the bucket strategy is simply as a guide for the allocation that you should have. This is beyond taking into account your risk tolerance, your ability to actually be disciplined in markets that go down, but saying, hey, I've got a year or two's worth of cash as my emergency fund or opportunities fund. Got a medium-term bucket full of bonds, benchmarking that maybe 5 to 8 years. Generally speaking, we wouldn't go beyond 10 years in those first two, but let's say 2 years of cash, 6 years of bonds, and then stocks on the other end. And instead of draining those buckets early on in retirement as a true bridge to Social Security, you're actually rebalancing between them because they're more of a guide. This is our preferred method, right? Because then you're not stuck with 90 to 100% stocks on the back end. There are ways to hybridize that, but if you're going to have an emergency and opportunities fund for the short term, if there's a quick market correction or if there's a bear market, then the bonds, and you can kind of burn through those, so to speak, and rebalance into stocks while they're low if they go down. That's how you're going to rebalance your way into a higher return over time.
Yeah. And one of the questions we get on that all the time is, should I refill what's our take on that?
Yes, to a certain extent.
And what does that mean for the people wondering?
Yeah. So there's going to be a certain point where your cash bucket is going to get down to close to zero. The reason it's there, by the way, is that it goes close to zero. So that's not something to necessarily be alarmed at. If we have 12, 18, or even 36 months worth of cash built up and start drawing it down and get down to 6 months left in that emergency fund because the market has not recovered the way we would like to see it, yeah, we're going to start refilling that short-term bucket and try to get you at least maintain that 6 month at the very minimum, but try to keep you around a year's worth of cash. In the bonds, that medium-term bucket, we're rebalancing between long-term and medium-term all the time. And that's just part of our investment discipline where we're trying to sell what's high, buy what's low. We know more often than not, stocks are going to be up, right? Doesn't mean they're going to blow the roof off the place every year. But if you ran a 5-year or a 10-year projection or even historically tested this, stocks are going to pretty often beat bonds. And so what we're doing is we're consistently chopping off those gains, keeping the allocation, let's say it's a 70% stock, 30% bond portfolio, keeping that allocation where it's at because we know that's the amount of risk we've got to take to make this retirement plan work. And we're rebalancing between those consistently.
Yeah. And last question on this that we hear all the time too, and we'll get on to the next withdrawal strategy afterwards. Is there a time that I shouldn't refill the buckets? Because we do get this question quite a bit. And again, that's why I alluded to earlier, buckets being kind of a variable depending on how people are approaching it and how they're asking the question.
Yeah, there's probably a couple of times. I mean, one that comes to mind is if you're drawing it down as part of a strategy to become more aggressive in the stock market. I mentioned this is kind of where we'll talk about the reverse glide path, right? If the goal of the portfolio is we're starting off more conservative so that we can avoid some of the sequence of returns risk, right? We talk a lot about building margin of safety into these plans. If we've gotten beyond that initial, not choppy period, it could be a good period, but beyond that initial risk of that bear market right at retirement. It doesn't put the risk of a bear market in our rearview mirror, but it does ultimately put that kind of retire, bam, bear market, puts that in the rear view. We don't really need as many bonds and as many years of bonds and cash saved up. And if we've come to that conclusion, if folks are comfortable with it and have goals like legacy goals, they want to give more, whether that's or to their kids or their grandkids, then we can start to have that conversation as Social Security kicks in. And towards age 67, full retirement age, or age 70, we start to allow the portfolio to drift higher in the stock allocation. So usually there's an upper limit to that. We're not letting someone who truly is more of a kind of 50% stock, 50% bond investor. We're not going to just say, hey, it'd be a great idea for you to drift up to 80% stocks. But somebody who starts in a moderate kind of 70-30 allocation, if they want to drift up to 80, 85% stocks because I don't really need this money and I'd really like to grow it for someone beyond myself, that can make a lot of sense.
100%. And again, that's why our favorite answer is always it depends, because it does. All right, so let's go to the last one that I wanted to talk about here, which is the Guyton-Klinger Guardrails. This is one that I think is coming up more often from our conversations that we've had.
Yeah.
What is that for somebody who doesn't know, or even maybe they do know to some degree, but they're like, is this right for me? Let's talk through that one a little bit.
Yeah, Guyton-Klinger, not exactly for the same reasons as the 4% rule, but it's not our favorite way to set it up. It can work, right? Don't hear me wrong. It can work, but it ends up with you changing your income quite often. Let's go through the positives first. Guyton-Klinger, it sets rules for your withdrawal rate. So there's basically 5 components. There's the initial withdrawal rate, somewhere between 4 and 6%. 6 is pretty high.
Yeah.
And will cause you to change your withdrawal rate more likely than if you start near 4 or 4.5. Then there's the upper guardrail. So generally speaking, if your withdrawal rate lowers more than 20%, so you started at, call it 6%, and it's gone down 0.12% because the market has performed favorably, that's going to be the upper guardrail and you can give yourself a raise. Then there's the lower guardrail, which is just the opposite. If your withdrawal rate goes up because the market's performed poorly and you're taking money out of your portfolio, you're going to give yourself a decrease in income. There's obviously inflation adjustments, which are baked into pretty much all these withdrawal strategies. And then there's longevity, which that one's a little bit, I don't want to say it's less important, but typically, like I said about getting beyond that first 5 to 10 years of retirement, sequence of return risks doesn't go away, but it's not as pronounced. So in the last 10 or 15 years of that Guyton-Klinger method, you're not really taking a decrease in income ever, no matter what the withdrawal rate gets to. So those are kind of the pieces and parts that make it up. Functionally, what can happen is it's pretty easy for the withdrawal rate to go outside of those bounds. So some people either start with a lower withdrawal rate and increase the amount that it would have to move before they actually make a change. But what can happen again is you ultimately might have to change your income at some point when you don't want to, or maybe when it's not possible to. That's the other piece of this that we don't really probably talk about enough, or it's not called out enough in these conversations, is there are times where people might need to spend less based off of some of these rules we put in place,
right? But
they can't for whatever reason that has popped up in their life.
Yeah, and that's just the blunt reality of retirement income planning. It's something you got to stay on top of. And while we're on that topic of just staying on top of things, there's a couple other components like I alluded to earlier that I want to bring back up again. Like, for example, creating the paycheck. It seems like a simple question, but if you've been receiving a paycheck for 40 years and somebody else wrote it for you, it's pretty easy. It's not something you have to think about. But how often and how much and really just how in general do I create a paycheck from my portfolio? It's a great question. It's one we get all the time. I'm happy to have you share that because Jake is the guy creating the paychecks for our clients. And it's one of those things that, again, this is going to vary based on how often and how much you want to look at this. There's some people that we say, hey, you're going to have to pay yourself and here's how you do it. Some people's eyes glaze over because they're like, oh, I didn't even think about that. And then there's other people that get all giddy and they're like, I can't wait. I'm going to pay myself every day, every hour on the hour. I can't wait for this to happen. Maybe not that often, but still, there's a couple different ways to think about this. Let's talk about what that looks like for people.
If I ask someone, how are you planning to get yourself income in retirement? Right. They can take that a lot of ways. Sometimes it's, oh, I have this dividend strategy. I was thinking I'll just kind of live off cash for a year and then refill it. Or, I hadn't really thought about that. Like, kind of just assumed I would have income and that's just how it goes. It's one of those things that can kind of slip through the cracks. Like, functionally, how do we create this paycheck in retirement? And I'm happy to report it's not rocket science. But when there's other things going on in the portfolio management side of things, it can get a little bit convoluted. So at its basic, what we're trying to do is replicate that paycheck that you got while you were working, so that honestly, you don't want to head into retirement, have all these changes in your life and not have the type of income you're accustomed to receiving. So then it's like ripping the Band-Aid off all these other things. And candidly, I mean, how many people do we know that really track their budget down to the cent every week, every day, spreadsheets, technology? There's not that many people.
Not many.
Right? So there is an emotional and a psychological component to this where it's easier to know what your paycheck is going to be and adjust your spending to that.
Right.
So it's important to create that paycheck in our mind. And so one of the best ways to do that is just going to be setting up an automated transfer from your custodian to your bank. So for us, we're using Altrust in a lot of these cases, and we're setting up an automated monthly or even twice a month type transfer from our clients' accounts to their bank. That's going to happen for us with a lot of rebalancing that happens throughout the month, throughout the quarter, throughout the year. That's part of our portfolio management duties for our clients. But if you're not working with a professional and you're trying to do it on your own, generally you're going to look at it about once a quarter. Hopefully you're keeping an eye on it a little bit more often than that, but once a quarter is usually sufficient. Raising the cash, and when I say that, what I mean is selling from the things that are up in the portfolio, because you're going to rebalance it at the same time. So if US large cap stocks are up in the portfolio, you're going to sell that and you're going to move it to cash. And you're going to use that cash, just let it sit in the portfolio, and you're going to use it to fund that automated transfer to your bank. We could talk a little bit more about portfolio management here. Like if you need to sell more than that, or if you need to rebalance while raising cash, we can kind of leave that to the side for a moment. But if you're going to be doing this quarterly, it's usually enough to do that as a rebalance. If you need to do more, then you'll know it. You'll see it in the headlines.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things that comes back to what we say a lot with retirement income planning, especially if you're a DIYer, is to set these rules and parameters on the front end, right? If you're treating your retirement income portfolio like a piggy bank, it's going to drain pretty darn quick.
Yeah, because it looks unlimited.
Exactly. Until it isn't, right? And the other thing is, as well is, we haven't really talked about this yet, but before you retire, and especially if you change jobs and you move around, you may have money at all these different custodians. I mean, we've seen people have them at almost dozens of different places, right? I have this one from this old 401k or this IRA, or my wife worked here and I worked here, etc. That is a absolute cluster to try to manage and pay yourself. That can just be an absolute nightmare. Make it easy for yourself. Pick a custodian, or for some reason, if you want 2 custodians, pick 2. I still think you're okay with picking 1, but if you want to pick 2, that's fine. 2 is better than 20. 2 is better than 12. Just make it simple for yourself, because otherwise it's going to be a full-time job. And bluntly, let's call it what it is. We're all humans, myself included. Things get missed. And if things get missed, that's the recipe for surprises. And no one likes surprises when it comes to retirement income planning, taxes, etc. You name it. It's going to depend on your situation, but try to eliminate as many of those variables and blind spots as much as you can. That's an easy one. Jake, I want you to go back over, though, what you were saying before, because I want to hit it on the custodian side, but ultimately you're right. This kind of bleeds into also portfolio management. What are some of the things that maybe people can do that, maybe they have thought about, maybe there's a better way to do it, or maybe it's just, hey, here's kind of the 2 different ways this can go. Obviously there's more than that, but high level, these are sort of the 2 paths that most people are in.
Yeah. So when it comes to rebalancing the portfolio, there's a lot that can go wrong if you're not paying attention, and if you don't have your eye on both the tax management of it and the rebalancing / income generating piece of it. So the tax management is going to come in particularly if you have like after tax or brokerage type accounts. You should be tax loss harvesting. You should be, and I know I talk a lot about selling while things are high, but this is actually the opposite of selling when things are low. Having a similar investment that you can go to that's going to accomplish a lot of the same goals as the previous one, locking in that loss so you can offset future gains and tax manage the portfolio in that way. The other piece that people miss is just having parameters for when you do rebalance. So you're going to rebalance when money comes in, when money goes out, and when the market moves. Money coming in and going out. In retirement, money probably doesn't come in quite that much, but inheritance happens, windfalls happen from maybe you move and sell a home and downsize and all that stuff.
Right.
That stuff can happen. You should rebalance when it happens. Money going out is going to be pretty regular. That's every month. I'm not suggesting you have to rebalance every month, but that's going to happen every single month. The market moving is the big one here. In between those quarters where you're raising cash, or maybe even while you're raising cash, the market could have moved in a significant way. And at that point, you need to not only raise cash. If you have after-tax accounts, you need to not only tax loss harvest, but you need to bring everything back into balance with where it was supposed to be. And when we talk about asset classes, we're just talking about types of investments you can own. So that's US large companies, it's small, medium-sized companies, international emerging markets. Those are the big ones. I mean, there's real estate and commodities and all that too.
Sure.
But those should all be benchmarked to a certain ratio in your portfolio. And every time you rebalance or raise cash or get new cash, it should be coming back into balance to those targets you had, or at least within certain parameters of, I don't want to let this get 5% outside of where it was before. That's the thing that gets missed a lot. And then you get 3, 4, 5 years into retirement and everything's out of whack.
So I think that about does it for us today. Jake, thanks for your insights on that. Obviously, there's a lot of ways to do this, right? You have to find what works for you. Maybe that's finding help. Maybe it's doing it yourself, but modifying one of these to your liking and to your fit. But if you have any questions, and again, out of everything that we talk about, this is probably one of those areas where we get the most questions. So if you have them, comment them down below. We love to answer it in a future video. We'd love to do some more of these live as well, where we can do FAQs. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, make sure you go ahead and click subscribe.